So I will call to order the meeting. We respectfully acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people where we live, learn, and play. Moving to item 2, adoption of the agenda. And there's a motion there. If someone would move that. Moved by Trustee Thorn, seconded by Trustee DeGroot. All those in favor? Motion carries. Moving to business and operations, the 2021-2022 annual budget. Mr. Secretary Treasurer, please.
Thank you. Sorry I didn't get handouts out or the attachments out in advance. Some of this has just kind of come together in advance of this meeting. But I'm going to start by walking through an updated year-end projection, because I think that's a great place to start to sort of frame how that has changed. I mean, I know I just brought you one. I brought you one with February, but I was able to do March's in time for this meeting. So I'm going to share the screen and show you what has changed. Now, what's different on this one is that any of the potential savings that we estimated from spring break are now incorporated. So we have staff who are off for those 2 weeks, and we do make a projection as to what will be not expended, and those are now reflected here. So I'll make it a little bit bigger. And I don't have much news to report on the revenue side. I will say that some of the contingencies that we were holding back for second semester staffing, I'm beginning to ease out of the holding bank and back into the projection as we're getting closer to the end of the year. I'm sure there'll be fewer students that will arrive, for instance, that will need EEA support at this point. So some of that has occurred. In particular interest is we're still coming very, very close to budget on our casual replacements. For illness and vacation, very, very close. I think that is going to go in a negative direction based on what we're seeing in this the last week or two with return to staff. It's a little bit higher than it normally would be, and I think the fatigue of the pandemic is starting to catch up with some of our staff, and we're seeing those rates go up a little bit. So this is at March 31st, and that may adjust a little bit, and are beginning to bring in a little bit of the unspent extracurricular department head in-service dollars as well. Looking at travel budgets, certainly nobody went anywhere, and I'm not expecting anybody to go anywhere for the balance of the year, and there could be a little bit more there as well. And utilities, we are through the winter and can now look at warmer weather, and we did have a pretty warm winter, so getting a little more aggressive in the projections, and now looking at approximately 2.038 million, which I'll go into detail into my next presentation as to how that adds to the existing surplus. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's any questions. We'll do it again on April 15th. One more time, just to test it. I don't imagine much will change unless we see that those absenteeism costs go up a little bit, and then that'll sort of lock down, I think, what would be available for the board to consider bringing in to balance the next year's budget.
We've got that small added increase coming, Jason. I think with the last DSAC meeting, remember, with some of the kids that are going to show up at the on Zoom board meeting.
Yeah, the kids will have some ideas, recommendations for next year's budget. I think we had a really good conversation with them at DSEC. I agree. We'll hear some proposals from them. I look forward to seeing what they come up with.
Are there any other questions or comments on this? Trustee Hutchins?
I was looking for an editorial comment from the Secretary Treasurer. Is he happy? Is it better than what he anticipated at this moment in time?
I will say that it is because of the support we've received from the provincial and the federal government. If you were to ask me before those grants came in at the end of last year, when we were budgeting, would I have projected that we would have this surplus? No, I think we would have projected that our absenteeism would have been even way more out of alignment And we knew that we had to put in a lot of extra cleaning supports, and without that funding, we wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing today. So I think it's a good place to be starting.
Thank you.
Any further questions from trustees? Okay, we're ready to go on.
Okay, well, here we go. This is the bulk of this meeting. I'm going to be putting up a PowerPoint, and it is hopefully not too lengthy, but it does go through sort of the things that I think we need to be considering in this budget cycle. By no means is it a balanced budget proposal. We're not there. We have a lot of work to do together and hearing from our partner groups, etc. But I'm going to start just sort of walking through the story of this year's budget. So that'll require me to share my screen, which means I won't see you for a bit here. And I'm going to do that here now. I'm going to make sure that you see a slide that is Cowichan Valley School District.
Yes, we do. I do. Yep.
Okay, now you probably see one that here we go. There.
There we go.
That looks pretty good. So this is the special Board Education and Business Committee meeting of April 13th. And I'm just framing it that sometimes the budget feels like a mammoth task, but it can always be balanced. It would just mean about good amount of work in looking at our priorities, at our guiding principles, at the strategic plan. But it is a big task. It is a big task for the board every year. And this Far Side cartoon reminded me of that. I thought it was pretty funny. And to frame, it's good to start the budget process by looking at the budget guiding principles that were previously adopted by the board. So the first one, the budget must properly fund the priorities within the strategic plan. So I think that's a key. Account for uncertainties. We've left in the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on the school district, as we know those are going to be continuing. Be transparent and include public and partner input through communication and consultation. So the survey is out now, and the meetings are scheduled for the partner groups and for the public to bring additional feedback into the budget process. And it must be transparent in a manner that those decisions are reported back to the public and partner groups. So when it's all finished, we need to be able to report why we have adopted the budget in the manner that we have, developed on the principle of equity, and balances the priorities of the strategic plan, the learning, Indigenous ways of knowing, culture, care, and future focus system. Of course, legally has to comply with the School Act and our collective agreements and other regulatory requirements, and should maintain an appropriate contingency balance, I think, at the end of it for any risk factors. So we do that outside of the budget through the surplus and not budget for a line item within the budget. So good to frame that, and then to look at those 4 priorities again. The budget needs to focus on learning, Indigenous ways of knowing, cultural care, and future focused systems. So we're still somewhat in a COVID-19 context, not to the degree that I believe that we were last year when we were budgeting. The ministry are expecting close to a stage 1, maybe a stage 1.5 opening. And we were I think in stage 4 when we ended up at the end of last year. And so we do need to be thinking about some of those COVID related pressures or protocols or practices that were implemented this past year that may wish to be continued for next year, such as custodial or programs of choice, etc. So I just want to frame that. We're still going to have continued impacts of COVID-19 into the next budget year. We know that the international student program is not going to be fully recovered. I think we know that will take some time for that to bounce back to its glory days of 2 years ago or before. We need to be thinking about those custodial requirements that may wish to be continued, and we're still waiting really for the ministry to set out what those expectations are of boards. But I think most boards are thinking about what they can be doing without those expectations. There's been an impact on the surplus estimates. I think it is a little healthier than I would have expected. And some of that is some of those savings and accounts, for example, the travel, for instance, that we had in the budget. Investment revenues, I note that as the province is reducing the rate that we get for our funds on deposit with them. However, because we've been surplusing over and above that budget, I don't believe we need to make any sort of budget adjustment. It'll actually be realigning itself. There's been an impact on enrollment. And that enrollment will have an impact on staffing levels. Fewer students, fewer staff, fewer classrooms, for instance. And then programs of choice. So there were some programs that were offered this year that are looking to be continued for next year. All need to go into the budget. So looking at our enrollment, you've seen this slide before, but it's back here just to sort of show you the wave that we've been riding of the declining enrollment, the bottom out in 2014-15, the ride back up, a little bit down this year, and then the expectation next year. And we hope that recovers, and that is too conservative of an estimate, but it is, based on what we know today, a pretty good calculation. It's always hard to know who's going to move into your community for in-migration or where students will attend, but we're starting the budget with a reduction of 187 students as our projection. And then beginning by looking at the revenue pie, still majority of the funding comes from provincial grants. Local education agreements, which is funding that flows through the local nations, local First Nations partners who have agreements with the board, accounts to about 7.11% of the board's funding. And then really the self-generated portions for rentals and leases and other revenue and interest revenue and international program make up the balance. And you can see how small of a piece of the pie that is for next year. So really relying pretty heavily on the provincial government. And then where is it spent? So the preliminary draft is showing, the bulk of it, of course, going into instruction. We're 81.2%, which is a good thing. About 3.83% in administration, 11.58% in operations and maintenance, another 3.23% in transportation, and just a little bit into operating capital, which is a software program that we have to upgrade to operate this district.
Jason, before you go on, can you tell us about how that compares with last year's budgeting?
Yeah, it's pretty close. The bulk of the wages are in the instruction, so this is the preliminary, not balanced, so it is a little bit greater than it normally would be, but those are pretty consistent percentages from year to year. Pretty close. And I'll have some data for the board a little bit later, not in this presentation today, but possibly later, which shows sort of some of those comparisons to other school districts that are of similar size, which is always interesting to kind of benchmark and see where is the board at in relation to administration or instruction or maintenance type of costs as compared to similar size island districts or similar size districts in the province. We've got some of that data collected from last year's budget.
Because I think operations and transportation are going to come at us hard this year for some reason.
And then it's broken up into the other pie, which is wages and benefits. And right now it's at 90.35%, which is pretty high, a little bit higher than usual. We typically operate somewhere in the 89s, with closer to 11% in services and supplies. So that's high because we haven't made any adjustments yet to the budget for that decline in enrollment. And I'll walk you through what that looks like once that happens. So we know that our budget is dynamic. I always say that it continuously changes. It ebbs and flows. It even changes during the budget process. We learn things as we go through this. But there's some things we don't know yet that aren't in our estimate. One, we don't have the benefit rates for teachers and principals. But we do know that we had a savings that we're bringing into the budget from our support staff because nobody was able to attend their health practitioner or dentist. So nobody went for a chiropractor appointment or a physio appointment or for a dental appointment between March and June. Not many did. That was where most people were not really sure how that was all going to work in the early phases of the pandemic. And because it's an experience-based benefit, what you spend is what you pay the next year. there's going to be some premium holidays still coming here. And if I was to guess, I think we still have about $200,000 we haven't brought into the budget yet for that premium holiday that we're unaware of. But I would guess that it would be in that range based on what the size of it was for CUPE. And we don't know, are there going to be any further targeted financial supports from the provincial or federal government? That was about 3.8 million this year. And boy, that would be important information to have right now as we go through the budget cycle, as far as, you know, are they going to provide more assistance for custodial or any of those other areas that we wish to continue? We don't know. So we have to be budgeting as if that it isn't there at the moment. And then there's the mixture of students. You know, what we saw this year was a number of families choose to send their children to distributed learning or virtual classroom models. So a little bit different models, and that has an effect on funding. If you attend those programs, that's about 80% of the traditional funding level. So that's something else we need to be thinking about. And then here we go. This is where we started. And I started with this big number, and and it is before adjustments. So when I know we start with the 4 million and the sky is falling, and the sky isn't falling as much as it appears at the beginning. But that's where we start if we take the rollover of the expenditures and what we know from our revenue. And there's some reasons for that. The first one is we balanced this year that we're in right now with $2.5 million worth of surplus. So without bringing in any other surplus, you got to make that up. I think the biggest one for me is, you know, it appears that in my calculations that the wage increases negotiated for teachers and support staff were underfunded by approximately $600,000. And I saw Nanaimo's media picked up that their district is reporting the same. I've spoken with another district south of us that's about 3/4 of our size, which is reporting about $450,000, pretty similar amount on scale. So I don't know how widespread that is provincially. I've also spoken with a very large Lower Mainland district that says they were ahead. But I'd like to find out more because I think, you know, that's when we get to what our actual shortfall is. That's part of the challenge right there. You know, these were negotiated settlements that we expected to receive the funding for. And then the next one, number 3, would be that drop in student numbers is going to drop funding. And then the impact is about $1 million in funding for 187 students. And then a little one, I just put it in there because I don't want to forget that we do need to make a capital purchase for financial and business software that we need to upgrade our system, which is 20 plus years old here at the board office. And unfortunately, it's very expensive. So you can quickly add those together and get your $4.1 million at a very high level. So here we go. Things we're thinking about. Again, not balanced, and maybe not thinking about things in the way that the board is thinking about things. So I'm looking for some feedback as we get to the end of this. But let's say that the board were to bring in $2 million. And I'll get to what's left in the budget after that. But you could access. I've just shown you 2.038 million in surplus from this year. But there's more in the pod. But then we have to offset that a little bit. So when we did the funding projections or the enrollment projections, we assumed that our DLVC students, which is the virtual classroom, would be mainly connected with the school again. And if they're shifting, I think they're shifting more to the DL model, and that changes them from a standard funding to a DL funding, which means that the projection that the province has provided us is over by about 205,000. We're not 100% sure on those DLVC numbers. I suspect that will come down and more students will come back to class. But right now, the number of kids that are in DLVC, if they roll over to next year with none of them coming back, that's what that number represents, what the reduction in funding would be for that program. But it's also staffed at a different level. So that would leave us with still short about $2.3 million to find. And then I've talked about a benefit premium holiday. So here a positive was going to help us reduce the shortfall. So CUPE and USW, we know that we overpaid their benefits for this current year because nobody went to the dentist in March, April, or May, or June. We know that number to be true, and we're taking that benefit premium holiday into the next school year. that drop in enrollment of 187 results in, in fewer classrooms. It's fewer fewer classrooms that have to be staffed, that have to be cleaned, etc. And there's some staffing reductions due to that decline in enrollment that I think can account for close to $1 million. We could fund the software upgrade from local capital. It is a capital expenditure. There is about $600,000 in local capital. There is a plan to replenish local capital. We could take that from that capital fund to offset that expenditure. And we always know this. I mean, I always bring this one in, and maybe we should just be building it into our budget right at the start. But we know that we take everybody we have today in our teaching staff and we roll them into next year. And then we increment everybody. So we give everybody their experience increments. And if you're a new teacher with less than 10 years experience, you're going to go up a band. But what we do know is that throughout the year, when we have a large workforce and staff may go off for one reason or another on a leave, and they're typically replaced with somebody who has less experience than they do. And that results in a lower cost for that position. And historically, that's been about $200,000. So that's a total of 1.5 million, which leaves us short $800,000 before we do anything else. And I'm going to come back to that wage funding. If that $600,000 was there for those wage increases, this wouldn't be a very big problem. So some of the additions that need to be considered, this is the mental health aspect, make a further investment. We have a LifeSpeak subscription. For the first part of that subscription, it was paid for by BCPC. What LifeSpeak is it's mental health resources and health resources for all staff. That's a subscription that the district has taken out. And I believe we need to put a little bit of extra funding into the health and wellness coordinator budget to make sure that program continues. As a really well subscribed subscription, we get an update on how many people watch those videos, and the more they're promoted, the better. There's talk of the district principle of literacy, and we would be funding that from in-service surplus. So we know that we're not fully expending those budgets this year, so there is a no cost there. We're going to find a way to do that with unspent funds from this year. Here's where I have talked to operations, and this is one area that we really need to have more discussion on, which is around how much custodial. So we've looked at the possibility of maintaining 2 full-time custodians to maintain that sprayer program. So maybe not every day, but every other day or so, that school gets access with that disinfectant. Again, not yet knowing what the protocols are for next year around cleaning standards. If the board were wishing to consider a principal or exempt compensation percentage adjustment, we've done a calculation on what it would be approximately at the same rate that the teachers are receiving for next year, which is 2%. So that would be an amount that could be considered. And there's an inclusive education equipment request pending. It's been many, many years since there's been funding for that equipment through the province. And I believe there's a number of it, much of it needing replacement and updating. And the same for vehicle replacements. I just have pending there because we're waiting to find out about our maintenance crew, maintenance fleet. And then we've also looked at, as through the feedback process on the calendar and from the budget feedback process for many years, it's been brought up that we could be looking at how to ensure there isn't a loss of pay for QP workers during the closure week, which could be done through a banking of time throughout the year, so that pay could be then paid when the district is closed. So I looked at it as well for the custodians who have that same situation for that week. And the total cost with those two groups combined would be about $384,000. And so then that would leave us in not a very good position. We'd still be looking for $1.5 million to balance this budget. So I think I'll just maybe pause here for a moment, because after this I move into descriptions of surplus and other funds, but just thought I'd pause, stop share, and see if there's any comments on what I've shared so far.
Are there any questions or comments from trustees at this point? Trustee Hutchins? You need to put your mic on, Trustee Hutchins.
Apologies. That list of add-ons, how do we prioritize? I mean, is there a number beside them of a scale of 1 to 10? This is a must and this is a maybe, and
Yeah, I'm hoping to get some of that from the board at board planning.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because it is the first time we put those in front of you, and I think you'll need some time to digest that and sort of provide that feedback back to staff.
Thank you. Trustee Croft?
When it comes to distance and blended learning and that kind of thing, are we looking at a new model, a post-COVID model? And the reason I ask is that what I recall of distance learning was that it was only suitable for a few kids because they had to be so independent. They rarely connected with the teacher and that kind of thing. But that's not the kind of remote learning that we're doing anymore. So am I right in thinking that the whole budget for remote learning must be different in a COVID reality than a pre-COVID reality?
I pass that to Secretary Treasurer or Superintendent.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely more demand. I'll say that, and I think Robin could speak a little bit more about any specific details in those programs. But we know that we're seeing larger numbers looking for those options.
Superintendent, do you have comments?
Thank you very much. I would like to suggest to Trustee Croft that when we have been developing the distance learning virtual classroom program, it has elements and characteristics that are certainly more classroom-like, where you are building a community, where you're looking at putting cohorts of students together in grade-alike groupings. And so therefore, yes, there are certainly elements in the distance learning programs that are very positive elements that families do want.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Can I just ask if we have any idea in terms of the number of parents who wish to continue or be in those programs next year?
Well, I could speak to what's projected at the moment, but I know that we're getting those numbers firmed up. So when I give you a projection, it may not match the reality of what actually comes in after those Mike's putting together a marketing plan, and we know that there'll be the request and the schools are now connecting with those parents who are part of those programs to find out who's coming back. But it was pretty early to have that information at the start of this cycle. There's still a lot of concern about what September looks like, but I'll say that our budget is built on 200 DL FTE.
And what do we have right now in DL?
Well, we had in last September we had 283, but many of the students have come in through the February count and will come in again through the May count. But if we're just looking at September to September, we're comparing 283 to 200. And the DLVC virtual classroom, we started with 135, but I believe we're now revising that number down somewhat. So what I have on this presentation with that negative number, I don't think it'll be as big as it is by the time we move into the next phase of the budget presentation, because if that number floats down to 100, that's now 35 students that go back to the regular class system.
Thank you. And do we have a target date for being as firm as we can be on the numbers?
Robin's got that.
Superintendent?
Yes, thank you very much. We have a marketing plan that's being put together by our Director of Communication. And presently we're looking at the dates of April the 22nd to really launch that marketing plan and opening it up for a 2-week period of time and closing for our currently registered students for May the 7th. And it's just to give us a window of where our parents and our families would like to register right now. Do they want to continue with their DLVC? Do they want to continue with some of the DL programs that they're currently in? So presently right now we are gathering that current information, but also launching that marketing plan so that we can really gather those more firm numbers as we move forward around the budget.
Thank you. I think we're ready to go on, Secretary Treasurer. Yeah.
Going back in.
Okay.
Hopefully you see my slide again. A second here, I gotta get it going. There we go. So I'm defining, what a budget is. It is an estimate. It is an itemized list of our income and expenses for a given period in the future. And there's 3 positions that a budget can be in. Revenues exceed expenditures, a surplus position. That's a good position. Revenues equal expenditures, a balanced position. There's no way we end up a year, or we probably cook the books if we're in a balanced position. Although one year we did end up with a $5,000 surplus, which was pretty incredible. And revenues are less than expenditures, a deficit position. We can't do that. That violates the School Act. So we're targeting for number 1, and then number 2, and then not number 3. But throughout the course of the year, some of our budgets become under or over expended due to unforeseen circumstances, because a budget is a best calculated estimate of what a certain category of expenses is going to cost or what our revenue expectations are. And so I showed you a little bit earlier a budget estimate or a surplus estimate of $2,038,455. When the board adopted the 2020-2021 amended annual budget, there was still $1,445,000 left unallocated. So when you put those together, there's almost $3.5 million that we'd project to have in surplus at the end of the year. And in this presentation, I accessed 2 million of that as a starting point for discussion. And the board does have a contingency policy, and there's going to be some more direction coming around surplus policies from the province very shortly. But I think we're fortunate that we already have this framework in place, which ensures that there's money for things that go poorly, such as managing a pandemic. So a range of 1% to 3% would be to try to maintain between 869,000 and 2.6 million in a contingency. And if we take 2 million of the budget of the surplus estimate, that would leave approximately 1.5 million or 1.7% of budget. So we still have a healthy surplus contingency within right in the middle of what the board's policy is. So I wanted to share that with you. Here's how we've used it. So this past year was the largest amount of surplus, this blue bar that we've brought in to help balance. And that was due to a lot of new expenses related to COVID. As you know, a lot of things happened in the fall that had to be reacted to very, very quickly. And you could just sort of see how it's gone up, and then we'd be trying to bring that reliance back down a bit again. How will decisions be made? Certainly seeking feedback from everybody. The survey is going to close on April 20th. I think last I heard from Mike Russell, our Director of Communications, was we had about 118 responses. So I'm happy that it is being, people have paid attention and are starting to answer it. I know we've had larger numbers, but given the context of what's happening in our world right now, I think that's a pretty good starting response. We still have some time left on it. We'll continue to update our forecasts on the surplus. We'll do one more at the middle of the month and see how that has changed or not changed. Hopefully it improves. And there's also areas of the budget where additional resources could be focused on both the board's 4 strategic priorities and the COVID safety protocols, which we need to be thinking about. Coming back to the Classroom Enhancement Fund, really no real change. The board receives funding for the Restored Teacher Collective Agreement language. That's a special purpose fund. I bring it up here as last year, that overhead component had been reduced, but it has been maintained for the next year. So The board can still expect 877,000 for overhead, which is sick leave for those teachers, professional development, education assistance, and human resources support that tracks the remedy. So I thought that was good news in the context of our budget. Other special purpose funds, the Learning Improvement Fund, which provides extra hours for CUPE, particularly education assistance that we jointly approve with CUPE as to how it will be allocated. It usually amounts to about an hour a week for CUPE to consult, work with teachers, work with each other, et cetera, work with their schools to plan and support classrooms. Community Link is up slightly for inflation, and that's really just the wage percentage going into that fund. So up from 660 something to 681. And the annual facilities grant remains as it usually is. This is exactly the same amount that was announced for this current year, $1,887,945. So still to come, there's a public meeting on April the 20th at 5:30 p.m. where we'll hopefully have some attendees and collect some more feedback. The survey went out a little bit late, so we extended it a little bit as well, but those results will be presented at the April 22nd BEBC committee. We'll continue to work on developing options to reduce the shortfall, and the next opportunity to present those is April 22nd. Then some final recommendations will be received at the regular board education and business committee meeting. Previously in our schedule, we were projecting having to wait until June to do a final adoption on the budget. I don't think we do, so we've adjusted this schedule now to May the 4th. Previously, there were often reconciliations that had to happen with the Classroom Enhancement Fund that prevented that early adoption. But it can be brought to the board for consideration on May the 4th if we're in a balanced position by then, with the hope of starting the staffing process the very next day, May 5th. And we're currently running all those calculations right now in the background to be ready for when a decision is made around the number of staff that are in the budget. So a lot of work to do in a short period of time.
Question, Secretary Treasurer, I heard that the DL and DLVC numbers aren't going to be available until May the 7th. So how does that work if we're trying to develop a budget and pass it by the 4th of May? We won't have all of the information.
Yeah, we're going to be having to budget with some contingency in our staffing for those situations. And we've already built that into our staffing model. I agree, we won't know it exactly, but we'll know whatever we do know at that point will be reflected in the budget. We won't have total, we never have our exact September number until it actually happens, but we'll have to go in with the best information that we have, because we do need to start staffing for the collective agreements around May.
Another question back to you. I understand the process of staffing and so on, but I also know that we are not needed to file our budget until the end of June. So why are we pushing the date then if we don't have the full information?
Well, we basically have to, well, we don't have to push the date. I'm just suggesting that we can't make a lot of changes around staffing after that date, which is 90% of our budget. So I don't know that there's many variations of information that's learned after that would be able to be adjusted, because we'd be down the path of having to have at least confirmed that we'll have X number of teachers and X number of EAs, et cetera, et cetera. So we essentially have to secure our budget by the end of April, and we've typically held it open just for the variations on the special purpose funds, but the operating has been locked down. But it doesn't have to be. We do have until the end of June, and if that's the direction of the board, we can leave that open, but I don't see being able to make many adjustments after the end of April.
And there's no way to hurry up the results of the DL numbers and DLVC numbers?
Robin's going to take that one.
Thank you very much. I think that we're intending to open it on April the 22nd with the intention of suggesting to our community and our parent population that it's open now. Please let us know what your selection would be for next year. Is it the bricks and mortar school? Is it your community school? Is it DLBC? So my hope would be that, as the Secretary Treasurer pointed out, that as we're moving toward the dates, we'll have a really good impression around where these students may go. We also know that principals currently right now are touching base with those families about what their intentions are. As a bit of a precursor to this is coming out, registration is being opened on April the 22nd. Please let us know what your intentions are. And I think that, as the Secretary Treasurer pointed out, that we do have those numbers still within our staffing model, but we'll just kind of hold it until we know where they actually go, because we do know that families do change their minds. They do really look at other options. We're in a very interesting time presently and currently with regard to the pandemic. So there could be some shifts, and I think that's why we want to be cautious. We know the students will be there. It's just a matter of where do they intend on going. And so we're going to, push that information along, trying to get it ASAP. So I think we'll have a really good indication overall, generally speaking.
Thank you. Secretary Treasurer. And then
And we've built some of that, as Superintendent has mentioned, we've built some of that flexibility into our staffing model this year. So it's not as traditional as it usually is. We've left a certain number of students just in contingency that we're claiming, not attached to a particular school or program, so that we can easily adjust that staffing that we've held one way or the other.
thank you. Trustee Croft.
I understand the the pickle about DL versus people in class, but I think, would it not be true that the whole COVID thing is kind of the same question? So, I mean, how do we make sure we have enough money for the extra custodial, for instance, and having masks and all that kind of stuff on hand, only to find out in September 15th that, woohoo, it's over. So do we set the money aside and then pivot, and can we move it afterwards? Or do we cross our fingers and hope the other levels of government are going to step up like they did this year? Do you have any suggestions on strategies there?
Secretary Treasurer, would you like to respond?
Yeah, you know what, that is a really big, complex part of this budget cycle. And my suggestion would be that for those items that we're unsure of, example, extra custodial, etc., that is a really good thing to access the contingency for. And if you don't have to do it, it goes back into your contingency. And if you get funded, it goes back into your contingency. But that's what a contingency is for unknowns. And I think maybe on those items that are have to do's, because we think we're going to need to be, example, custodial services. That's partly why, when I looked at what to bring in to help balance the budget, I chose $2 million and left a conservative approach on what was remaining in the contingency. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions from trustees? Back to you, Secretary Treasurer.
Oops, I lost my screen here. Hang on a second. I think my next slide was actually questions from trustees. So I'm going to share it here and see if that's where I did end up. Where was I at here? Yes, it was. So that was where it was all to end what I had for you at this phase. So the point of all of this was just to really kind of frame the challenge, the reasons why we have a challenge, the items that need to be prioritized, and to really go over the surplus, and hopefully in other conversations through the feedback from the public and the partner groups and the board, will start to establish what those priorities are and start to shift some of those things around. And there are still some unknowns. I do think we can reduce some of that DLVC money that I had shown going down a little bit for kids that come back optimistically. I do think there's another savings from the teacher, principal, vice principal benefit group that hasn't been brought in because we haven't been told it yet. I'm hopeful that, if the province does make any announcements around after their budget, the budget is April 20th. Will that allow the Ministry of Education, if there are going to be additional funds for protocols for the fall, to announce them? I have to wait and see, but I think that's a pretty key date is April 20th to really know what's coming into the ministry.
Thank you. Any further questions from trustees? Okay. So would you just like to tell us the next piece of the process?
Well, we have planning sessions. So I'm certainly interested in some of the board's feedback there before we come back into the next BEBC. So over the next week, once we come out of planning, I'll take the feedback and begin to work with that. So we're ready for the next time. And we'll continue to look at any of those budgets that haven't been brought in. For example, one of the things that came out of the advisory conversation that isn't incorporated here yet is, will we travel as much? What we did is we had the same travel budget that we had pre-COVID times still in our budget because it's rolled over. But we're meeting by Zoom a lot now, and I don't imagine that's going to change significantly. So just things like that, well, we can start to look at some of those smaller items that can add up when you put them together to help to address that shortfall.
Thank you. Anything further? Okay, moving to a motion to adjourn. Moved by trustee DeGroot, seconded by trustee Croft. All those in favor? Motion carries.